The first few Castlevania games really did numbers, but after that, it was kind of a mixed bag. Konami released at least 3 main Castlevania games for every console generation, but generally speaking, sales were never really that consistent after Super 4 on the SNES. The GBA games did well, but the series really struggled to find its footing as a serious contender in the 3D console game space. I really like the N64 games, but I don't know, I guess kids were like into Tony Hawk's or something. The industry was really starting to care less and less about smaller passion projects and more about big tentpole events. Actually, so were Konami. By the 2000s, Konami had some big hitter franchises that they were more than happy to invest in, as well as some smaller bench warmers that they were less inclined to. Konami closed 2 studios in 2002, and looking at their catalogue from the time, it is really likely that they were deciding which franchises to keep and which franchises to ditch. For Castlevania, it was San Marino or bust. The series was handed to Koji Igarashi, who had directed the fan favourite Symphony of the Night on the PlayStation 1. Konami gave him a massive team made up of Konami All-Stars and collaborators from all of his previous Castlevania games. These included the legendary illustrator Ayami Kojima and musician Michiru Yamane. Konami told him he could do whatever he wanted, so he set about sort of soft rebooting the storyline. I've maintained when covering the Castlevania series that one thing that I love about this franchise is that each game could be really different from the last. And I think the strength of the series is that each game has been made by a completely different team. Given that the central conceit is a never-ending war between Count Dracula and the forces of good, each new Castlevania game tends to be set in a different time period with a different protagonist. And with that comes the opportunity to explore new things. At the very least, this can mean a different visual style, but quite often this can mean things like new gameplay mechanics. But with all of that inconsistency came a pretty inconsistent track record for sales. Maybe that loose approach to canon and to gameplay was actually affecting the bottom line. We'll never really know for sure, but Iga's big concept was to unify the storyline, to streamline the gameplay, and to make it all feel like it belongs to the same franchise. Igarashi's soft reboot of the Castlevania franchise, released as Castlevania Lament of Innocence in America, absolutely smashed the sales. It was released at Christmas in 2003, one of the best years for games. It went up against Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, Devil May Cry 2, the first Splinter Cell, fucking Morrowind, and instead of getting completely bodied by one of the best years for action games, Lament of Innocence is actually the second best-selling Castlevania game ever. It did surprisingly well. I've made a much longer video about Lament of Innocence, which you can check out here. No doubt buoyed up by the incredible success of Lament of Innocence, as well as the very well received Game Boy Advance games, Konami told Iga just to keep the same team going. You're obviously good at this, stick to it, and they gave him 2 years to get another game out, to recapture that lightning in a bottle. Contrary to the pattern set down by previous games, the story for Curse of Darkness takes place 3 years after Castlevania 3 for the NES. I don't know if the team was strapped for new ideas, but Iga has said he basically just really wanted to make a direct sequel to what was then a 20-year-old NES game. The big finale of Castlevania 3 is Trafficard and Grant the Fourth Wheel teaming up to kill Count Dracula. The opening of Curse of Darkness, though, tells us that at the moment of his death, Big Vlad does a big old spell and curses the land as a sort of final up yours to the Belmonts. So now there's monsters roaming the land, killing indiscriminately, spreading death and disease. Even the people have sort of turned into these feral cultists wailing on about 5G and the woke mob. It's a hellscape, not entirely unlike contemporary Britain. And I suppose that's why they call it the Curse of Darkness. This is actually kind of similar to the setup of Simon's Quest on the NES, which starts out with a similar thing happening when Simon kills Dracula. I guess what we're learning here is Dracula is not a good sport. Castlevania 2 was about Simon questing across Transylvania in the shadow of Dracula's curse. Curse of Darkness is about Hector also dealing with Dracula's curse, but in the sequel to a game called Dracula's Curse. Wow, that's weird. Anyway, Hector was previously one of Dracula's henchmen. He was in fact a Devil Forgemaster, which means he could summon creatures and gribblies which Dracula was using to bolster the ranks in his Night Horde. Hector handed his notice in due to the toxic working conditions in Castle Dracula, and also after finding out that the so-called King of Vampires was only paying the legal minimum into his pension contributions. That and the fact that his boss was, like eating kids and stuff. Anyway, he quits, he retires to the country to settle down with his wife. The opening act informs us that Hector's old workmate, another Devil Forgemaster called Isaac, just turns up one day and murders his wife. Therefore, motivated by revenge, Hector sets off to the ruins of Castle Dracula to hunt Isaac down. And this friendly, not at all creepy dude in a dressing gown shows up, and he's all too happy to help Hector find his way into the castle, help him find his way to Isaac. It's a very simple setup. I'm sure nothing is going to get in the way or complicate things, and I certainly hope that this fella is on the up and up. I really like how these two PS2 games play off of one another. Lament of Innocence was a story about Leon Belmont going to Dracula's castle to rescue his wife. But Curse of Darkness is about a man going up there to avenge his wife's death. If the first game is a game centred around fear, then this is a story centred around grief. If you've seen that great Netflix show, then you'll probably recognise the names Hector, Isaac, the term Devil Forgemasters. Seasons 2 and 3 of that show took a lot of inspiration from Curse of Darkness, which makes a lot of sense because Season 1 was so heavily based on Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. The show did a really good job of taking all of the characters and the setting of this game and adapting it into something a little more easily digestible, because the game lacks any subtlety. It's a very 2000s anime vibe. Isaac, for a start, is very different.
I was the one who lured you here.
Saint Germain is here as well, but instead of being Bill Nighy, he's played by Jacob Rees-Mogg. Another thing, though, which stands out to me is that Hector isn't a Belmont. It's not uncommon to play as a non-Belmont by this point. In fact, there is a nice little tradition every few games that you get to play somebody kind of ancillary to the main Belmont bloodline. John Morris from the New Generation and Reinhard Schneider from Castlevania 64, they weren't Belmonts, but they were written to be related to the Belmonts. Alucard from Symphony of the Night and Cornell from Legacy of Darkness were the first true non-Belmonts. So it is far from the first time that you've ever played as a non-Belmont. But this game does have the honour of being the first time that you get to fight a Belmont. Now, because Hector isn't a Belmont, he doesn't have the whip, the famous vampire killer whip. Instead, he uses all kinds of different weapons. It's like Curse took a page out of Symphony of the Night's playbook. Enemies will drop weapons after you kill them, which you can then pick up and use. So as you're going through the first areas of the game, you're getting used to fighting enemies, picking up drops, trying out all the weapon types. And there's a lot, so you're still doing this late into the game. There are 60 weapons in this game, divided into 8 different types. Now you know the score with stuff like this. Knuckle weapons are super fast, but they require really short range. Axes do crazy damage, but the wind up and the cooldown is just excruciating. Spears have moderate speed, but great reach. All that good stuff. Spread over knuckle, rapier, blade, sword, hatchet, axe and spear. There's something here to suit your playstyle, and there's often one or two which stand out as being really the very best in their category. As I previously said, a chunk of these weapons are dropped by enemies, but a lot of them you can only get by crafting. Not only do enemies drop weapons, but they also drop raw materials which you can then combine to make new weapons. You can also sometimes combine 2 weapons into one, so you don't end up with like 100 short swords in your inventory or whatever. And for completionists, there are 10 super secret special weapons, including crazy OP stuff like a minigun, and really just the kind of silly nonsense that you would expect from a 2000s Konami game. Like Symphony of the Night, there's also a bunch of rings, secret items and accessories to find. There are 20 helmets and 25 suits of armour that can all either be found or crafted. Also, like Symphony of the Night, none of these items are actually reflected with cosmetic changes to the character model, they just change the stats. There isn't much in this world that I can say that I hate, but I hate that. I hate it. Speaking of stats, the RPG-ish elements are back from Symphony of the Night. XP and leveling was present in Lament of Innocence, but this was basically just a linear, you get better and learn new combos as you play the game kind of thing. But Curse delves a lot deeper into stats for strength and agility and constitution, that kind of thing. You've got D&D-like stats for elemental damage, stuff like light and dark, and earth, wind, fire, water, heart.
I am Captain Planet!
These show not just how much damage you're doing with your gear, but also how much damage reduction that you can tank. And as we're talking about things which are brought over from Symphony of the Night, there's also teleport rooms and save rooms from Symphony. This does help with the backtracking, which you will be doing a lot of if you want to find everything. It does have a 3D Symphony of the Night kind of vibe, as opposed to the more hub room approach of Lament of Innocence. I do feel like Lament was a step forward into something new and interesting, and Curse does actually feel a little bit like Eager retreating back into what he already knows. If that is all there was to it, then COD would feel like just a slightly flabbier version of Symphony of the Night. But there are some big differences here which really help it stand alone as its own thing. As I mentioned, Trevor is a Devil Forgemaster, able to summon spirits from hell and forge them into warriors for Dracula's Night Horde. The biggest difference between the game and the anime is the way in which Devil Forgemastery works. In the cartoon, devil forging involves imbuing the corpses of the dead with souls extracted from hell. This leads to the creation of crazy, misshapen demons, the form of which is guided by the intent of the Forgemaster. It's metal as fuck, and it is actually way cooler in the show than it is in the game. In the game, Hector's creations are called innocent devils, and most of them are either really cute at best or really stupid looking at worst. I will come back to this in greater detail, but devil forging is Curse of Darkness's first major USP, and this is the one thing that makes it different from previous Castlevania games. Building on the lock-on, dodge, combo and parry system from Castlevania 64 and Lament of Innocence, Curse introduces stealing. Yeah, When you're locked onto an enemy, the lock-on reticle will go pink, which means that you have a really short, often ridiculously short, time window to hit circle and steal from the enemy that you're locked onto. And every enemy in the game has a unique thing that you can steal from them. Low-level enemies will give up stuff like money, but higher-level enemies are holding unique crafting materials which you can use to craft new weapons. The best weapons in the game, in fact, and nearly all of the secret weapons can only be crafted with materials which can only be stolen from the hardest enemies in the game. Some enemies, in fact, are outrageously hard to steal from. Not only do you need to be in super close proximity, but for some enemies, the window is literally a handful of frames, often in the single digits. So you have to time this perfectly. Sometimes you even have to hit the steal button a bit early so that you can time the stealing animation to land just as the reticle goes pink. Bosses are the hardest things to steal from because once the boss fight is over, your chance of getting whatever material it was they were carrying is gone forever. Basically what I'm saying is it takes an outrageously long time to 100% this game. It feels far more attached to that Symphony of the Night model where there isn't actually that much of a focus on 100%ing it. There's so much stuff, it doesn't really matter if you find it all because any given playthrough will yield tons of new things and tons of stuff to keep you interested.
That whip.
Once you've got to grips with all of this new stuff, the first act is capped off with a fight against Trevor Belmont. This fight is nails. You might have a couple of low-level innocent devils, you might have found a few half-decent weapons, but Trevor has got every trick in the book. Every sub-weapon, crazy combos. You are so weak by comparison. This is really the first real pinch point in the game, but I love the fact that this one boss fight is so hard, because of course it would be hard. It's Treffy. And now is the part of the video where I will speak about innocent devils for 4 minutes. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the big, key, unique selling point of Castlevania Curse of Darkness is devil forging. As a game mechanic, devil forging for me is just the right level of complexity that it can be fun without feeling sloggy or grindy at any point. Innocent devils come in 5 flavours, and each one of those can then be evolved down various different evolution trees. You know, like how some Pokemon have different evolutions depending on how you evolve them? Yeah, it's basically like that. Each evolution path will unlock different stats, unique skills, as well as actually changing the way the ID looks. All told, there are 10 unique fairy types, 9 battle types, 10 bird types, 10 mage types, and 3 devil types. This doesn't include the 9 secret pumpkin types. Whilst it would be sick if you could turn the bodies of your slain enemies into new soldiers, it doesn't really work like that in game. At various points in the game will just give you a brand new ID type, coincidentally right at the point where you will need that ID's unique abilities. Stuff like a bird type which can help you glide over a gap, or battle types that can help you clear heavy obstacles. These little abilities that the IDs have aren't really used anywhere near enough in my opinion, because IDs for the most part are basically used for fighting baddies or for healing Hector. Innocent devils are pretty much an extension of the familiars from Symphony of the Night, but unlike just leveling up like they did in Symphony, they can now evolve. And the way that you evolve your IDs is by collecting Evo crystals. These Evo crystals are randomly dropped by defeated enemies depending on which weapon type Hector has equipped. So if you want to evolve your speed male into a corpsey, then you'll need to defeat a load of enemies with spears. You can have multiples of the same ID type, so you don't have to worry too much about evolving yourself into a corner or making the wrong decision. And periodically your IDs will lay eggs, I guess, which you can then hatch into new baby IDs, and then you can evolve them up. So you could get one of everything in one playthrough as long as you were happy to grind, but it isn't necessary to get one of everything to experience the full range of the game. However, if you take this for an example, there was a door that I reached through the game, but actually I didn't have the ability to open it. It was an ability held by an ID that I didn't have. So I teleported back to the shop, hatched one of my ID eggs, and then basically just ran it back through the corridor all the way back to the door. Now, because this is relatively late game and those late game enemies are worth so much XP, I leveled my ID up and unlocked the skills I needed in less than 15 minutes just walking back to that door. That is some late game sure, but it does also speak to how well ingrained these systems are that you never really feel up the creek. It's pretty obvious to say that there's some kind of Pokemon influence here, but I also think it's worth remembering that Konami is the company behind Yu-Gi-Oh! It does actually kind of make sense to bring the capturing, evolving monsters concept into Castlevania. These two franchises feel really congruent when put together. And as my friend HPR Shredder pointed out, the designs are actually also pretty similar. So with all that in mind, can we just talk about how madly complicated all of this stuff is? This game came out in 2005. For reference, 2005 is the year the first God of War came out. I've played God of War all the way through, and that game is literally square, square, triangle for about 10 hours. Lament of Innocence, which came out in 2003, was also pretty much square, square, triangle, but sometimes circle and occasionally L1. Curse of Darkness might actually be slightly too complex for the year it came out. The overlapping systems of stealing materials, crafting weapons, and evolving IDs. There are even weapons which you need to craft in order to get the final evolution of some of your IDs. One system feeds the other, which feeds the other. It is this really great little feedback loop, but it just sounds really weird when you say it out loud. I found this to be a really fun little set of systems, and it is far deeper and richer than Lament of Innocence, and actually of most games from this year. But speaking as a smooth-brained square, square, triangle enjoyer, I actually almost found myself drifting away from this because it was just slightly too complicated. Oh god, and that's before I even talk about the chairs? So there's 24 secret chairs in this game, hidden around all the different levels, which when you find them, Hector can sit in them and it gives you a brief description of what the chair is and what it's about. And there is a secret hidden chair room which slowly populates with all the chairs which you've sat in. So if you find all 24 chairs, you can have all the chairs. I mean, it does nothing. It does nothing other than it's a room full of chairs. Oh, I've got to say it. Quality game, mate. By way of compensating for all that complexity, Curse of Darkness is a lot more linear than Lament of Innocence. Where Lament had that central hub area where you could complete each stage in any order you wanted, COD is just a linear path through each level. Corridors and rooms which lead into more corridors and more rooms. Even outside areas have invisible walls to kettle you in the right direction. There are a few secret hidden areas around the place, a few breakable walls, a bit of wall meat and so on to incentivize a bit of exploration, but you don't really get the feeling that you're exploring somewhere big. In fact, it actually feels quite cramped. There isn't a great deal of verticality, and it doesn't really have the feeling of exploring a spooky old castle, more like experiencing it on rails as it rolls past you like you're on a ghost train or something. I don't actually mind this. It actually gives a lot more of those old school Castlevania vibes, and I mean, quite frankly, I like that. The second act, as you would probably expect, would usually be dominated by backtracking, going back to find more powerful items, evolving your IDs before taking on the challenge in the back third. But because of the way the levels are laid out, The design of this game doesn't really feel like exploration was a big focus because it doesn't actually always feel that fun. The second act is capped off with another fight against Trevor. Facing Trevor for the second time is so much fun, partly because it's so easy when compared to the first. It does a really good job of demonstrating how far you've come in the game, but really in fact all of the bosses start to become cake as the game rolls on. Your IDs are doing the lion's share of the fighting, and they are also tanking most of the damage. You get the opportunity to get a few good licks in, to work up a few combos, but you'll barely be using any health items, and you will rarely, if ever, attempt a boss fight more than once or twice, especially once you get into the back third. Like any classic Castlevania game, the third act of Curse of Darkness is pretty much just a grind as you run up to that final boss fight. Each room throws more and heavier enemies at you as a way to try to increase the challenge. It's pretty easy to get your late game devils leveled up here as they're doing so much work. But if you are trying to evolve some baby devils, these later sections are really hard, so it's good to keep some muscle in the squad. Shout out to the Infinite Corridor. Unlike in the cartoon, where the Infinite Corridor is this sort of Dark Tower style nexus of parallel realities, in the game it is literally just a really long corridor. I was expecting the Castlevania version of Rainbow Road, and I was a little bit disappointed because it's basically just a really long grey corridor filled with lads. Likewise, Dracula's castle is also just a really long corridor. Room of men, corridor, room of men. It's not really even hard, it's just donkey work, you know? Anyway, the final act beckons. Hector has been tracking Isaac this whole time, getting closer and closer to getting his revenge. But along the way, Hector finds that there's a bigger picture at play. Someone has been pulling Isaac's strings the whole time. Hector and Isaac are both just pawns in a much bigger game. The story plays out in pre-rendered cutscenes at set points in the game. Like Lament of Innocence, the acting is kinda OTT and a little silly, so I wouldn't blame you for phasing out while these cutscenes are running. The big twist is the creepy dude in the dressing gown who was acting like a creep from the very beginning and being well shifty turns out to be a bad person. And apparently everyone is really surprised by this.
Was your desire for vengeance weak?
I'm back to making comparisons to Symphony of the Night, but it's actually just the same plot as Symphony of the Night. An evil priest who misses smooches with Dracula and just wants him back so bad. So I cooked up a story and dropped the 6 of us into the meat grinder. He manipulates the main characters, he uses their weaknesses against them in order to use them to raise Dwack you daddy once again. So here we are, and now you gotta kill Dracula. Again. As is the way with Castlevania games, you've got to fight death first. No spoilers, but a bit like in the anime, Death has been present the entire time, masquerading as a different character, and then going mask off just ever so slightly too early while there's still time to actually mess up his plans. Like, bruv, just keep stum for literally 5 more minutes and then you'd get away with all of it. Anyway, I binned him off easy enough, and then we're on to Dracula. Dracula, though, is an absolute slog. I wouldn't necessarily say this is altogether surprising at this point. That's kind of a hallmark of the series. You've got your classic 2 Dracula forms. The first form goes down fairly smoothly. The second form, though, is really similar to Castlevania 64 / Legacy of Darkness, in that it's this wild demon form with you balancing on a really tiny little platform. He's firing all kinds of mad stuff at you, you're slogging through it, using all your items, trying to dodge fireballs and what have you. And then finally, with one big push, Hector shuts the door on Dracula for another however many years, finally achieving his vengeance and maybe even finding a new love along the way. Hector's story ends with him off to finally retire in the country, and there we have it. If I had to rank COD against other Castlevania games, it would definitely come up somewhere in the top half. And it sold pretty well too, 420,000 copies across Xbox and PlayStation 2. Interestingly enough, it's the only Castlevania game which was released on the Xbox. And that's far from the worst sales for a Castlevania game. But when you look at it in a wider context, for the team size which Konami had committed to this project and the scale of the production, it sold about as well as one of the GBA or DS games, which they could make with like a dozen people. Curse of Darkness wasn't the final Castlevania game. Iga's unified vision meant a lot of the creative team who worked on these two games stayed on to continue making more Castlevania games for the Nintendo DS. The series struggled on for a couple more years after this, and the DS games are in fact pretty decent and just recently got a re-release. But Curse of Darkness was the final console game in the main Castlevania canon. Clearly, Konami hadn't planned to end the franchise here. They'd just spent all this effort opening up the potential for more stories in the continuity. In the final cutscene of the game, Saint-Germain says that he's going into the far future for the final battle between Count Dracula and humankind. Is this hinting at a planned future game, or is it just dropping a spicy little rumour? We don't really know. But after the release of Curse, Iga said that he had big plans for Castlevania in the future. He'd already planned out Dawn of Sorrow and the next two DS games. He had plans to release a Castlevania game on the Wii. He started spitting rhetorical about this idea he had for a Castlevania game that was like set inside cyberspace, where Dracula was a virus and the Belmonts were like hacking into the mainframe or whatever. This just gives me like Shadowrun, Neuromancer vibes, and honestly, like vampires and cyberpunk, yeah, I'd kill for that game. The bottom line is Curse of Darkness is really well made. It goes to some really fun places, and honestly, it deserved better than to be the footnote of the franchise. But the world was changing in 2005. The industry was growing ever bigger. Teams were exploding in size. The mid to late 2000s saw near enough the entire industry pivoting to big projects, big budgets. Konami basically retreated from any risky projects, and Castlevania was one of them. This was the last big game that Iga worked on. From here, he moved on to smaller, more focused teams, making smaller, more focused games. I don't mind calling Curse of Darkness a spiritual successor to Symphony of the Night, but Curse just didn't get that same modern reappraisal that Symphony did. It isn't considered a classic. It pretty much faded into obscurity until the Netflix anime started taking characters from it. Because of this game, Castlevania was essentially nailed into its coffin, waiting for the day that a creepy dude in a dressing gown or an emotionally imbalanced teenager could revive it again, one day in the distant future. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to see some more, I have covered every major Castlevania game on the channel, so please check out my previous uploads. If you want to stay tuned to see more stuff like this in future, then hit subscribe, and if you'd like to support the channel in a financial capacity, then you can do so in the links below the video. You can become a channel contributor via YouTube memberships, Patreon or Ko-fi. All of these are really a tip-based system, but I do have some perks for people who wish to support me on higher tiers. Big shout out to my most recent contributors, Lottie Loves Lemons and The Crawl. And I'll see you in the next upload. Alright then. Ta-da.